No one noticed the cave at first. It sat quietly on the limestone ridge, half hidden behind a stand of Douglas firs, its dark mouth facing southeast. In January of 1891, northern Montana was already cold, relentless, and steady. Families burned cord after cord of wood, trying to stay warm, but often failing. The wind cut through cabins like knives, and frost crept inside, forming white patterns on floors and windows. Out here,
Look, it's 62
survival was a
degrees.
quiet fight against nature's
It's getting
patience.
warmer, 72
3
now.
miles west of the small settlement, trappers and hunters passed the cave without a second glance. No smoke rose from it. No tracks lingered. From the outside, it looked empty, abandoned, useless. But inside, something extraordinary was taking shape, something that would shock everyone when they finally saw it. Her name was Mara Witt. She was 32, widowed just 8 months before when her husband drowned in the swift spring melt of the Milk River. The river had looked calm that day, but it had claimed him without warning. Mara buried him herself, aided by neighbors who brought shovels and whispered words of sympathy that faded as the months passed. By fall, winter was coming, and Mara was left alone with her 2 children, a cabin that could not keep them warm, and no hope that the world would make it easier. Her daughter Eliza was 9, quiet and observant, her eyes reflecting her mother's determination. Her son Thomas was 5, restless even in the cold, climbing walls and tugging at the edges of blankets, unable to stay still. Their cabin was a hastily built structure, square corners, plank floor, a stone chimney that always leaked smoke when the wind came from the north, which it often did. Mara worked as a seamstress, sewing shirts and mending clothes for passing loggers and trappers. The pay was enough for flour, salt pork, and a few essentials, but it could not keep a fire burning all winter. The year before, she had burned 9 cords of wood and still woken to ice forming on the inside of the windows. Her children slept wrapped in layers of wool, their breath fogging the air beneath the blankets. Mara lay awake many nights, listening to the fire die down, knowing she could not afford more wood. Winter in Montana did not rush. It was steady, patient, and merciless, waiting for mistakes. By late summer, Mara understood that she needed a solution, not a perfect one, just one that worked. She remembered the cave. Years earlier, she had found it while foraging for chokecherries along the limestone ridge. The opening was narrow, no more than 8 feet across, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Inside, the cave widened into a chamber 20 feet across, with a high ceiling tapering toward the back wall. The cave ran 40 feet deep and, most importantly, was dry. Water sometimes seeped near the entrance in heavy rain,
Look, it's 62
but the back
degrees.
stayed clean and moisture-free.
It's
Even in
getting
summer,
warmer,
the
72
stone was
now.
cold to the touch. Mara knew what that meant. Stone held temperature, changed slowly. It absorbed heat and released it just as slowly. She had read, listened, and lived long enough to understand that most cabins failed, not because of lack of fire, but because heat escaped through thin walls and chimneys. People burned more wood trying to replace heat that vanished. Cabins were meant to be above ground, chimneys clean, fires roaring. Living in a cave seemed like desperation, a step backward. Mara didn't care what people thought. She cared about keeping her children alive and warm. In late September, she began hauling materials to the cave. Rough-cut lumber from sawmill discard piles, clay dug from the riverbank, flat stones scavenged from old homesteads, dried moss and pine pitch. She worked early mornings before sewing and on Sundays after church while the children played nearby. She told no one, asked no permission. She was not building a house. She was building a shelter inside a house nature had already insulated with 60 feet of limestone. The cave was already protective, but Mara knew it was not enough. Cold air sank, warm air rose, stone pulled heat away through direct contact. Any warmth they produced would escape unless she stopped it. She built a room inside the cave, 15 feet back from the entrance, where the ceiling was high. She framed a rectangular structure, 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet high, just big enough for the 3 of them to live without pressing against each other. The walls were double-layered. First, vertical planks sealed with clay and moss. Then, 12 inches outward, A second wall with the space between loosely packed with dried grass and pine needles. Trapped air slowed heat loss better than solid wood ever could. The floor came next. Mara laid flat stones on the cave floor, then built a raised plank floor with a 4-inch gap. Cold air settled below. Warmth stayed where they lived. The ceiling was layered with boards, canvas salvaged from an old wagon cover, and more boards. Heat rose, warmed the ceiling, and stayed. The entrance faced away from the cave mouth. A small vestibule acted as an airlock. Cold drafts would weaken before reaching the living space. At the back wall, where the limestone ran deepest, she built her heat source.
Look, it's 62
not
degrees.
A fireplace, but a masonry stove.
It's getting warmer.
She had
72
seen
now.
one in a German homestead cabin 2 years before. The firebox was small. Heat traveled through stone channels before leaving, warming the walls instead of rushing out. She built it from clay and stone, mortared carefully. She lined the limestone wall behind it with reverse stones, creating a radiant wall to absorb heat and release it slowly. Mara did not calculate numbers. She simply understood the system. Stove, radiant wall, stone floor, cave itself, layers within layers. By early November, the work was done. The first hard freeze had arrived. Mara moved her children into the shelter with blankets, a table, 2 chairs, cooking pots, and her sewing supplies. Everything fit. The space felt smaller than the cabin but warmer immediately. She burned 3 logs that night. The thermometer on the wall read 62 degrees. The children slept without shivering. Word spread slowly. People whispered, often mocking. "Stone will weep moisture. The children will get sick," said one carpenter at the general store. Mara did not argue. She only checked the stove, added a log here and there, and let the stone do the work. By January 6th, the cold arrived. The temperature dropped 28 degrees in 6 hours. By dawn, it was 26 below zero and stayed there. Families burned wood faster than ever. Chimneys backdraft, smoke-filled rooms, and livestock froze where they stood. Meanwhile, Mara's cave remained steady, warm, calm. 3 logs. That was all she needed. The cold did not stop. It pressed down on the settlement like an invisible weight. By the second week of January, the snow was thick, and the wind never fully ceased. Cabins that had always stood strong now felt fragile. Chimneys backdraft, filling rooms with smoke that burned eyes and lungs. Families rationed firewood, moving from room to room just to survive. Children cried at night, not from hunger, but from cold that sank deep into their bones. The Gunderson family, living in one of the town's better-built cabins, burned through nearly a cord of wood every 4 days. Mrs. Gunderson wrapped hot stones in cloth and pressed them against her children while they slept. Even then, frost formed along the edges of the floorboards. She whispered to neighbors that they would not make it to March
Look, it's
if the cold
62
held.
degrees.
And it did. Word
It's
of
getting
Mara's
warmer,
cave shelter
72
spread
now.
slowly,
Incredible.
quietly. People avoided her, thinking her survival must come at some cost. Stone would weep moisture. Children would get sick. There would be mold, collapse, suffocation. All predictions came from fear, from not understanding how Mara had built her refuge. Reverend William Kayfax, making his rounds to check on the elderly and families with children, approached the limestone ridge, expecting the worst. No smoke rose from the cave mouth, only a thin wisp drifting lazily. He called out and Mara appeared, wearing a wool dress, no coat, no shawl. Her children followed, playing with carved wooden animals. Their cheeks were pink, lively, healthy. "Come in if you like," Mara said, gesturing inside. "Close the outer door behind you." The Reverend stepped into the vestibule and immediately felt it. Warmth, steady and calm. No roaring fire, no choking smoke, just heat that stayed. Inside, the thermometer read 82 degrees. Reverend Kayfax froze, disbelief etched on his face. "It has been between 78 and 84 all week," Mara explained. "I burned 3 logs this morning." He asked how long the warmth lasted after the fire died. Mara opened the stove door. Faint coals glowed. "This fire's been going 6 hours. I'll add 1 log before bed. The room stays above 70 until morning." If I let it go out completely, it drops to 65. The Reverend, staring at the thermometer, realized what he was witnessing. A room warmer than any cabin in town, using a fraction of the wood. He went straight to Eugene Straude, the carpenter who had criticized Mara openly at the general store. "You need to see this cave," the Reverend said. Straude snorted, thinking it impossible. "She's holding over 80 degrees with 2 logs a day," Kfax insisted. The carpenter froze, disbelief breaking his pride. 2 days later, a dozen townspeople had visited the cave. Some stayed away, prideful or fearful, but those who came left in silence. Each felt the calm warmth immediately, steady, reliable. Cabins outside burned 6 to 8 logs a day just to maintain 40 to 50 degrees. Mara's space stayed at 80 with 3 logs. When fires died, the cabins plummeted,
Look, it's 62
but Mara's
degrees.
room held warmth all night.
It's
Questions
getting warmer,
came.
72
How
now.
thick are the walls? How wide is the air gap? What kind of stone works best? Can a masonry stove be built into a cabin? Mara answered carefully, explaining the principles without showing off. Simon Voss, a trapper, added a double wall to the north side of his cabin, packing it with dried moss. His interior temperature rose 12 degrees without burning more wood. Abigail French rebuilt her fireplace into a simple masonry heater using river stone and clay. Wood use dropped nearly in half. The changes spread quietly, unevenly. Some adopted everything Mara taught. Others took pieces. A vestibule here, a double wall there. Outside, the winter showed no mercy. Chimneys cracked under thermal stress, some collapsing during the night, filling cabins with smoke. Families escaped barefoot into the snow. Fires in desperate cabins sparked, some burning entire homes. Survival became private. Opening a door meant losing warmth. Mara's cave remained calm, routine, predictable. She sewed during the day, tended the stove in the morning and evening. Children played on the warm floor, no gloves needed. The wood stacked outside barely shrank. By late February, the truth was undeniable. Mara had not just survived the winter. She had beaten it. When spring finally came, slowly and reluctantly, the settlement saw the cost of survival. Across the surrounding counties, 11 people had died, most from exposure, 2 from cabin fires, 1 from smoke inhalation when a chimney collapsed. Livestock losses were severe. Families dismantled fences and sheds for fuel. Some abandoned homesteads entirely, retreating east. In Mara's settlement, no one had died, though wood piles had diminished. Mara had burned 4.5 cords of wood, yet 3 cords remained stacked outside the cave. That fact spread faster than any sermon or argument. People came to the cave not for curiosity anymore, but necessity. They tapped the stone floors with their boots, measured walls with rope, asked questions again and again, hoping repetition would turn understanding into certainty. A Norwegian homesteader named Karina Bjornsted visited with her husband. They had survived in a sod house that leaked and lost heat through the roof. Karina
Look,
ran her
it's
hand
62
along the
degrees.
double wall, shaking her
It's
head.
getting warmer,
"This is
72
smarter
now.
than anything we built back home," she whispered. Mara sketched on a piece of slate, showing how to create thermal mass, trap air between walls, and place a masonry stove so heat stayed. 2 months later, the Bjornsteds rebuilt their home using Mara's ideas. Wood use dropped 60%, and their home stayed warm through every cold snap. The knowledge spread unevenly, as practical wisdom always does. Some people adopted all Mara's methods, others only parts. A rancher named Clayton Hodges built a masonry heater in his barn. His horses survived the next winter without loss. Constance Merrill, the schoolteacher, insisted on double walls when the new schoolhouse was built. Children removed coats indoors. Firewood costs dropped by half. Even Eugene Straude changed. Pride prevented an apology, but all cabins he built after 1891 had thicker walls, stone floors, and masonry heaters instead of open fireplaces. When asked why, he said simply, thermal efficiency, basic physics. By 1895, more than 30 structures within 50 miles reflected Mara's principles. No one called it a movement. No one wrote it down, but winters were easier. would lasted longer. Children slept through the night without shivering. Inside the cave, life settled into calm routine. Mara sewed during the day, cooked meals, tended the stove, and watched her children play. Snowstorms came, blizzards raged, but inside the limestone shelter, warmth remained. 3 logs a day kept the space steady. Outside, the settlement suffered. Fires roared, smoke choked, families shivered, and livestock froze. Inside, Mara's children laughed while rolling wooden animals across the stone floor. Mara's quiet genius was now part of every visit, every lesson, every measured wall and stove channel she had shared. Spring arrived slowly that year, reluctant to loosen winter's grip. The snowbanks melted inch by inch, rivers freed themselves from ice, and the sun finally began to offer warmth instead of just light. The settlement opened its doors again, revealing the true cost of the long, punishing winter. Families who had survived were thinner, quieter, their faces etched with exhaustion. Wood piles were gone,
it's 62 degrees.
and some had burned their savings in the desperate fight to stay
72
warm.
now.
The losses were staggering. 11 people had died from exposure, 2 from fires started by desperate attempts to heat failing stoves, and 1 from smoke inhalation when a chimney collapsed. Livestock losses had devastated many families. Mara's cave told a very different story. She had used 4.5 cords of wood, and 3 cords still remained outside, untouched. Her children were healthy, cheerful, and wrapped in warmth instead of layers of wool. News of her survival spread like wildfire. Initially, people came out of curiosity, hesitant to believe what they had heard. They tapped the stone floors, walked along the walls, measured the space, asked questions over and over. Some were skeptics, some were hopeful, but every visitor left impressed, if silent. The cave held warmth effortlessly. Cabins burned through logs and still failed. Mara's space stayed steady, calm, and above 70 degrees. Karina Bjornsted, a Norwegian homesteader, and her husband came to see for themselves. Their sod house had leaked, lost heat through the roof, and failed miserably. Karina ran her hand along the double walls Mara had built and whispered, "This is smarter than anything we built back home." Mara explained quietly, sketching on a slate how stone absorbs and releases heat, how trapped air slows heat loss, and how a small masonry stove could spread warmth efficiently. 2 months later, the Bjornsteds rebuilt their home, incorporating Mara's designs. Their wood consumption dropped by 60%, and they stayed warm through every cold snap that year. The knowledge spread slowly. Practical wisdom rarely moves quickly, but it spreads steadily, affecting people in different ways. Some adopted Mara's principles fully. Others borrowed bits and pieces, double walls here, a small stove there. Clayton Hodges, a local rancher, built a masonry heater in his barn, keeping his horses safe through winter. Constance Merrill, the schoolteacher, insisted on double walls when constructing a new schoolhouse. Children removed coats indoors and firewood costs dropped. Even Eugene Straude, the carpenter who had once mocked Mara, changed his building methods. Pride prevented a public acknowledgement, but all of his cabins built after 1891 had thicker walls, stone floors, and masonry heaters instead of open
it's
fireplaces.
62 degrees.
When asked why, he simply
It's
said,
getting warmer, 72
thermal
now.
efficiency, basic physics. By 1895, more than 30 structures within 50 miles reflected Mara's designs. No one called it a movement, no one wrote it down, but winters became easier. Wood lasted longer, children slept without shivering, and families suffered less. Life inside the cave settled into routine. Mara sewed during the day, prepared meals, and tended the stove each morning and evening. Her children played on the warm stone floor, laughter echoing off the limestone walls. Winter storms raged outside, but inside the cave, the temperature remained steady. 3 logs a day kept it warm, calm, and safe. Mara's careful design had not only survived the coldest winter in 45 years, but had created a model that changed how people approached survival. Her lessons were simple yet profound. Stone could store and release heat. Air trapped between walls acted as insulation. A small, carefully placed masonry stove could spread warmth without burning excessive wood. Mara did not invent anything new. She observed, respected the laws of nature, and used them to protect her children. While the settlement had struggled, frozen and exhausted, Mara had lived comfortably, demonstrating that understanding, not force, was the key to survival. By 1903, a geologist measuring limestone formations in the area recorded the cave's interior temperature on a December afternoon. No fire had been burning for weeks. The thermometer read 51 degrees inside, 19 outside. Stone remembered. It absorbed, held, and released heat long after human intervention had ceased. Mara's principles lived on, quietly embedded in the walls, stoves, and floors of cabins, schools, and barns across the region. People who had once mocked her were now using her ideas, teaching their children, and incorporating them into every structure built for warmth. Mara lived in the cave for 6 more years, guiding her children, teaching what she had learned, and helping neighbors when they sought her advice. When her children grew, she built a modest house in town. It was warm, comfortable, and an extension of everything she had learned from the cave. The limestone shelter remained, a quiet, reliable refuge for trappers and hunters during storms,
Look,
a symbol of practical knowledge and persistence. Its double walls held, the stone floor stayed dry, and the masonry stove kept warmth flowing evenly. Mara passed away in 1924 at 65 years old. No plaques commemorated her. No speeches honored her contributions. Her name faded from everyday conversation. But the wisdom she embodied did not disappear. It persisted in the buildings, the designs, and the understanding that warmth was not about bigger fires but about retaining what you had created. The cave on the limestone ridge west of town still sits, its mouth dark, its interior steady. Stone does not forget. It absorbs, holds, and releases. And during the coldest winter in 45 years, Mara demonstrated that survival was not about struggling against nature but listening to it, understanding it, and letting it work for you. She had created 82 degrees of calm, not through force, but through quiet, intelligent observation. Her legacy, unspoken yet powerful, lived on in every cabin built with thicker walls, every stone floor, and every masonry heater that spread warmth efficiently. Children slept without shivering. Families preserved firewood, survived storms, and embraced a knowledge that had once been hidden in a quiet limestone cave. The world outside froze, chaos reigned, and yet inside, there was warmth, comfort, and safety. Mara's understanding had changed a community, saved lives, and proved that sometimes, the simplest solutions, guided by observation and respect for nature, are the most extraordinary.